Unfortunately, we have to cut short the discussion, which I think we already had, and move right away into the second part of this morning, which is dedicated to sustainability, teacher plans, and ancestral futures. I hope everyone has picked up a program, because I'm not really giving too much introductions because we have so much to say and so much to talk about. But I would like to ask Fabio Scarano to join me here on the page seat, not on stage, unless people are moving around a bit, but I think we will continue with our program. Sure. Here we go. Fabio's talk will be dedicated to the regeneration cell of Gaia, plant species as a sword for healing the planet. You have been at Conservation International for many years. You're just heading a new foundation for development. You're an expert in sustainability and ecology. We're very, very glad to have you here today. I think it is going to be wonderfully interesting to sort of embed the conversation in larger issues of ecology and sustainability, because I think apart from all the healing and therapeutical aspects of teacher plans and botany, we should also all admit that botany has become, or plants and the life of plants, has become a realm of incredible political concern to all of us. Thank you so much for sharing your thoughts with us.
I thank you, Daniela. It's a great pleasure to be here. I'm thankful to you and to all the organizers for this invitation. It's been a very exciting couple of days. I have already learned a great deal. And what I brought today to discuss with you, it's a fairly simple idea, and I believe I'm not going to be very long. But if I do get too long on that, you please let me know, Daniela. But, well, I would start from what I think is an important point, and I think we all here know that the planet is going through a very big crisis, and it's probably the biggest in history, and because it's multiple in many ways. We have an ongoing economic crisis, and apparently economic model and the development model that didn't quite work, or at least it's clearly not sustainable. It's not sustainable because we reached the point that as a society, our greenhouse gas emission has been so high, and every year it breaks new records, that we reach the point where even if we stop all carbon emission right now, which is unthinkable, we are still going to feel the effects of global warming at least during the next 100 years. So we are beyond mitigation. It's no longer a matter of reducing carbon emission only. It's already becoming a matter of adapting to a new climate scenario in a very near future. Actually, right now, in many places of the world, we're already feeling such effects. So we have basically entered a new era, and this has been recognized by the group of scientists that take part, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, JPCC. Some of you may have heard about the JPCC report. It comes out every 7 years and gives a state of the climate in the planet and everything associated to it. I took part in the team of 800 authors. We were 800 authors in the last one that just came out last September. In this report shows precisely that we have entered this new era, adaptation, and as a society, we have to adapt to a new climate scenario. And in thinking about this new scenario, it makes us wonder how the planet is going to be looking like 50 years from now or 100 years from now. And it's always very difficult to imagine adaptation to things that are not out there yet. we are normally adapting to circumstances as they happen, but it's very difficult to forecast how the planet is going to be looking like. So even for individuals like us, for organisms, adaptation is always a difficult process to imagine. Imagine for the society as a whole, or for the planet as a whole. And what I thought about discussing with you today is about the Gaia hypothesis of James Lovelock. Is a hypothesis that came out in 1979, and it was very controversial when it came about because Lovelock is a scientist, and many people in the scientific community didn't like his hypothesis very much because it was not readily testable. And Gaia, the hypothesis as he developed it became popularized, and you know, sometimes scientists don't like things to get too popular, so it received a lot of criticism. But it's a very simple hypothesis. Basically, Lovelock proposed that the planet Earth is a living being, Gaia, and this living being, therefore, it has dynamic stability. So in his view, life on Earth would always be there. So life on Earth, the biosphere, is like the skin of the planet, and it would always be there. His point, though, was that human beings would not necessarily always be there, because we were dealing with the planet in bad ways in many occasions, and therefore the things that we need for our life, they would probably no longer be there in time. So I would like to start our discussion here from this premise. Let's imagine Lovelock's hypothesis is totally correct. The planet is a living being. And when we think of living beings, every living being has regeneration cells. In the case of the human being, these cells are called stem cells. That's where regeneration happens. And you guys, I'm sure most of you have heard about all the medicine that's taking place with stem cells. Plants have meristems, which are cells that produce new growth and regeneration in new cells. So we started to wonder, if the planet's going through so much trouble with climate change, with land use change, and we can consider that the skin of the planet, the biosphere, has many wounds by now, and these wounds are progressing as we do more of our action on the planet. If Gaia is a living being, our question was, which are the regeneration cells of Gaia? So if Gaia is an organism, if the planet is an organism, we would expect the planet to have such regeneration cells. Then our next question, obviously, was, which are those? Where are such cells? And me and a group of friends, we started to investigate. We started our search for regeneration cells of Gaia on plants. And it was a pretty obvious choice, not only because we are botanists, but also because of the fact that 99% of the biomass of the planet is composed of plants. So there was, I would say, a statistical chance that if there are such things as regeneration cells of Gaia, they would be most likely, although not exclusively, on plants. So imagine that such regeneration cells of Gaia would be plant species that are able to get established in places that have been extremely altered, new habitats that might be formed as climate progressively changes. As the planet gets progressively warmer, we may get forests, and there are a number of very strong scientific predictions of that. The Amazon forest may become a savanna in 100 years. There are some savannas that may become deserts in 100 years. And how are these places going to be looking like? Which organisms are going to be able to live there? And as we started to ask ourselves this question, of course, we need to understand which plants are going to be able to adapt to this strange new future of a warmer planet. We have to understand enough ecology, physiology, and genetics of such plants. And what happens nowadays is that we know quite a bit of that, but only for a few plants. We don't know enough about the Amazonian plants, for instance, that we have been discussing so much here during this week. The plants that science knows the most are productive plants, so agricultural plants, forestry plants. We know a lot about those. And perhaps not surprisingly, 80% of everything we eat in the planet, it's only 10 plant species. So imagine the risk if things go wrong and these 10 plant species do not adapt to future climate scenario. What are we going to be eating? So we haven't been creative enough in our eating strategy, I would say. And the fact that we don't know enough about the huge diversity of species that are out there in the planet puts us in a pretty tricky situation by now. So we know a lot about agricultural plants. During the past 30 years, we learned a great deal about rare species, thanks to biological conservation as a science. Scientists focus a lot on understanding what's behind being rare. And we have some understanding about some rare species. But you must agree with me that the rare, it's not always, but oftentimes the rare are the most fragile. The populations are small. So you can imagine also that probabilistically, if things change dramatically, maybe the rare ones are the ones that are going to go first, right? So the very productive ones, they are very sensitive to very small changes in temperature, in rainfall. So highly productive and rare plants that we know a lot about, they may not be there 100 years, 200 years from now. A third type of plant that we know a lot about is what the scientists call model plants. Such model plants they became nearly laboratory plants. There's a genus called Arabidopsis, and a lot of genetic research is done on that one. And such plants, they've been so long in the laboratory that there are not so many of them out there in nature anymore. So deep down, there's a bunch of common plants out there that we know very little about them. And I have the impression, and my friends, that some such plants, they may be the plants of the future. If we are, as a species, as human beings, if we expect to carry on being part of Gaia, as Gaia changes, we are going to need a set of basic ecosystem services that the ecosystems provide to us without asking nothing for exchange. So stable climate, water in quality and quantity, food, which is generated not only by plants, but also by pollinators, for instance. These elements, culture, all these elements are, I would say that the guardian of all such ecosystem services that are vital for us, the guardian of such ecosystem services is biodiversity. If you don't have biodiversity, you are not going to have good water supply. Your climate is going to be messed up. You are not going to have food. So that's the basics. And we are losing 1,000 times more species every year than we would be losing if evolution would proceed naturally without our interference on the planet. It's 1,000 times. That's the lowest estimate of the amount of species we lose every year. So the fact that we've been losing so much biodiversity, the fact that we know so little about it, puts us in this difficult situation about what's going to be of us in the future. I'm pretty sure biodiversity is going to carry on being out there, and I do agree with Lovelock. I think this planet is going to have life still for a long time. It's going to be perennial. But what concerns us the most now is whether we are going to carry on being part of Gaia or not. So we, having this in mind, in this thought that we developed, myself and a group of friends, it's been very recent. We published a couple of papers on that one. Of course, we have our own examples in our nature. Back there, some plants from the Brazilian Atlantic forest, some plants from the Brazilian Amazon, that we think they are potential candidates for being such repairing cells of the planet. And what do then, as we begin to think that some of such plants could have this characteristic, we started to think, well, we need to search for more, and which are the traits that such species have that make them similar to each other. And what we find out when we look at some of these plants is that all of them they are very plastic, which ecologically, which means that they can live well in different circumstances. They are plants that have long-distance dispersal mechanisms. They are plants that are taken far away, be it by wind or by flying animals or by water, the seeds. They are also plants that grow slowly. They are not fast-growing plants. And you see, most of the highly productive plants, agricultural plants, the forest plants that we use for biomass, they are fast-growing ones. So it seems that these plants of the future, if we are correct, they have this similar characteristic. And I'll give you one example only that I think can illustrate what I'm talking about these strange types of plants that change behavior as situation changes. I don't know if, how many of you have been to Rio in Brazil? Some of you, right? So those of you who have been to Rio or have seen Rio in pictures, you are going to notice that and Rio is famous for its beaches. And we also have mountains in the state of Rio. And the vegetation that lives there in this biome, the biome is called Atlantic forest. Only 10% of the Atlantic forest is left. Most Brazilian lives by the sea, and when we were colonized 500 years ago, that's where most people got established. So most of the vegetation is gone, only 10% is left, but still the Atlantic forest is considered a biodiversity hotspot. It's one such places where there's a huge amount of plant and animal species, high diversity, and many such species. They are fairly rare in nature by now. But the fact with the Atlantic forest is that you can go, in the state of Rio, for instance, you can go from the sea to 2,500 meters in a peak called Agulhas Negras. It's a 70-kilometer straight line. So it's not too much, right? You go from sea level to high altitudes in a very narrow range. And what happens there is that what you get in the mountains is tropical rainforest, cloudy forest often, beautiful plants, very, very rich diversity of species. And 10,000 years ago, at the coast of Rio, the ocean was hitting the mountains. During the past 10,000 years, the ocean went back and forth 3 times. 10,000 years ago, 8,000 years ago, 5,000 years ago, and then again, 4th time, 3,000 years ago. So 3,000 years ago, there was no sandbanks, right? The mountain and sea. 3,000 years ago, the sea moved back once again. And that created these vast sandy plains, which are, you have dune formation, you have fixed dunes, and we call in Brazil restinga, this area. Restinga are sandy coastal plains. Now, in the top of the forest, in the rainforest, there's a group of plant species that we call them stranglers. They germinate, birds take the seeds, they germinate on the top of tree trunks, which you can imagine, germination on a tree trunk is not very easy, right? No soil, not much water, and they send roots down, sometimes 20 meters down. They send the roots until the roots reach the ground. It begins to get nutrient. Gradually, these roots that they go down, they circle the tree and they strangle them. years go by, and this strangler takes the place of the tree it killed. There's a very common strangler called ficus, and there's another strangler, not as common, but more beautiful, I would say, called clusia. So clusia in the rainforest is a strangler. Now, you go to the Restingas, you go down the mountains to the beach, and you're going to find in some parts of Rio this beautiful vegetation. If you look from the space, it's white, as the sand is white down there, with green circles. These green circles, they are vegetation islands. And the central plant in the islands is our clusia. The same strangler from the rainforest, it migrated down to the beach when the sea went back. And it arrived at the beach. It's like a desert, really. It doesn't rain as it rains in the mountain. Very, very hot. And these plants were able to establish, by different mechanisms, on the sand. And you must agree with me, germinating and growing on the top of a tree trunk with very little nutrients, not very different from germinating and growing on sand. No nutrient, very little water. These plants are super economic with water. They don't acquire as much carbon. Clusia does photosynthesis at night. Can you imagine that? It's the opposite. Only a few plants in nature do that. It remains with stomata closed all day. Opens stomata. Stomata is the pore of the leaf. It opens the stomata at night, and it captures CO2. The CO2 remains closed in the leaf as a big malate molecule. And during the day, as the sun hits the leaf, with the stomata closed, no transpiration, the malate is broken in many carbon. That's how it acquires carbon. So it's a plant that grows slowly. But the fact is that clusia uses so little water and produces such a beautiful shade. It's a beautiful plant. It's a picture I cannot show it to you here. That underneath clusia, in this desert beach, you get 1 plant species per square meter. So you can have 100 plant species underneath one single clusia. So our beach vegetation in Brazil, they are incredibly rich in plant diversity. And you can argue that most of that diversity is due to one plant species that in its evolutionary history went from being a strangler in the rainforest that kills other plants to being a facilitator on the sand. And I tell you, there are many such strange species out there. And evolutionarily, it's adapted to life with very little nutrient and very little water on top of tree trunks. If I was a scientist already, 3,000 years ago, living at the Atlantic Forest Mountains, if I know all the science I know nowadays, and the ocean was still hitting the mountain, we didn't have the big sandy plains, I would never, never imagine that this strangler would one day go down to the beach and make life easier for other plant species. Never imagine. It's unthinkable. You can't predict that. But the fact is that there are many such species out there. We can even be one ourselves with all our intelligence, right? I hope we just have intelligence enough to deal with a wounded planet as it is right now. But anyway, this capacity to adapt to a circumstance that was not part of your evolutionary history is what Stephen Jay Gould, American scientist, used to call exaptation. It's not adaptation, it's exaptation. Exaptation is to adapt to something that's not out there yet. We have some cases like that in the Amazon, which is very impressive, with plants that are able to fixate nitrogen, areas that have been degraded in the Amazon by mining, that became completely sterile. They have been 6 months later colonized by nitrogen fixers that were brought by flooding, and the Amazonian rivers, they can keep parts of the vegetation underwater for 6 months in many places. And as the flooding comes, it brings nutrients, it brings seeds, and sterile areas become vegetated again. And once again, you can imagine these plants were never used to occupy desert, sterile areas, and still there they are. So basically our point is that we see tremendous hope for Gaia, and we think Gaia is going, as it's been doing for many years now, it's always able to regenerate and find intelligent ways to keep it going, to keep its skin alive, the biosphere. And we just hope that mankind can adapt to these new circumstances that we have created ourselves, and we find in nature plants that are able not only to heal us, which is very much the topic of this symposium, and it's so interesting, the diversity of and the healing power that we have on nature, but we have also to begin to think about how plants can heal the planet, not only how plants can heal us. And I'm sure if we keep using them to heal us, we are going to be brighter in order to help the plants heal the planet. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Fabio. I will pass on the microphone to Sarah Shenker. She's an expert from Survival International, a movement that is protecting the rights of indigenous ancestral people, the expert on Latin America and Central America. And I'm very glad to welcome you here today and like to ask you to make your...
Thank you very much, Daniela. Thank you, Francesca, and everyone at the TBA 21 team for making this fantastic event happen. And to Anna, Ernesto, Alexandre, and most importantly of all, I suppose, the Huni Kuin for sharing with us some of their insights about their life and their forest. As Daniela said, my name's Sarah. I work at Survival International, which is the global movement for indigenous people's rights. And we run international campaigns alongside indigenous peoples all around the world to help them defend their rights and protect their land so that they can choose what kind of futures they want to lead on those lands. And we've been hearing in the last few days a lot of really interesting information about the bond that indigenous people, well, the Huni Kuin and indigenous people more widely have with their land. And indigenous leaders often say that their land provides them with absolutely everything that they need, their medicine, their food, their shelter, their water. So they compare it to hospitals and to homes, and it's also their school. It's everything for them. And so I'd just like to speak a little bit about the political context in which these peoples and these lands now find themselves, and the threats that the lands are currently under, and the reaction of indigenous peoples in Brazil and their allies, their reaction to these threats. There are 243 tribes in Brazil, and they total around 900,000 people, which is about 0.5% of the total Brazilian population. And they live all around the country, as most of us already know, in the Amazon forest, in the scrub forest, the Atlantic forest, and also in urban areas. And indigenous peoples in Brazil, as all around the world, are the best conservationists. They're the best people at looking after their forest because they depend completely on their forest, and they have such a strong bond with it. They have depended on it for millennia and have looked after it for so long. In some parts of the world at the moment, indigenous peoples are being moved off their land in the name of conservation. And this is a really dangerous move, which we're trying to prevent because indigenous peoples provide a key barrier to deforestation, actually. And it's really amazing to look at satellite imagery, for example. If you look at satellite imagery of the Amazon, you see that indigenous territories are like islands of green, in some cases completely surrounded by deforestation. So indigenous peoples are not only looking after their land for their own well-being, but actually they're also providing a fundamental service to mankind as we are fighting against environmental degradation and climate change. 20% of the Brazilian Amazon is currently protected and looked after by indigenous peoples. And the law, in theory, does help indigenous peoples in Brazil and around the world. The Brazilian constitution recognizes indigenous peoples' right to the exclusive use of their land and to be able to live on it without invasions from outside. Oh, yes, okay, I'll speak more slowly. Okay. International law also says that indigenous peoples' lands must be protected for their exclusive use. That happens in some places. Looking at a map of the Amazon, you see large areas of demarcated, mapped out indigenous territories, such as the territories where the Huni Kuin live in Acre. And that's good, but not all indigenous territories have been mapped out. And also, it's not just about mapping out on paper, it's also about the protection of that land. And there are several challenges that indigenous peoples face today. Illegal mining, illegal logging, mega development projects like dams and roads, factories on their land, carbon credit schemes, and also at the moment in Brazil, a series of dangerous laws which Congress is trying to pass, which would seriously weaken indigenous peoples' control over their lands and would actually make it much less likely that other indigenous territories will be mapped out in the future. So I'd like to give a few examples of how these challenges are being played out in real life. So let's go first to the Guarani people. The Guarani live south of the Amazon in Mato Grosso do Sul state, and they also live across the border in Argentina, in Paraguay, and in Bolivia. And there are about 51,000 Guarani in Brazil, so they're the largest tribe in Brazil. And they were one of the tribes that was contacted very soon after the Europeans arrived in Latin America over 500 years ago. As I said, the Guarani live in a state called Mato Grosso do Sul, which means thick forest of the south. But actually, a lot of that forest has been destroyed. A lot of it was stolen from the Guarani in the 1950s, in the 1960s, and it was given to ranchers. And so subsequently, almost all of the Guarani's ancestral territory has been destroyed. And they have such a strong connection to that territory as the Huni Kuin do to theirs in a different way. The Guarani are very spiritual people as well. They call their land their tecoha, which means their place without evil. And ritual and song and dance are a hugely important part of their life. When they have even a tiny bit of land, one of the first things they do is to build an oca, which is a prayer house, and kids learn, like this one exactly. And kids learn from a very young age how to sing and how to dance and how to participate in these rituals. So we know that they have such a strong connection to that land, but that land has been almost entirely destroyed. So the Guarani have been left living in overcrowded reserves and in roadside camps where violence rates are extremely high, malnutrition. The Guarani Kaiowá people, which is one subgroup of the Guarani, actually have the highest suicide rate in the world as a result of the loss of their land. That's what they themselves tell us, is that this suicide is happening because without land, they cannot be Guarani, and they don't have a meaning to live. On the other hand, the Guarani are extremely strong and resilient people. So the demarcation, the mapping out process that the government is supposed to be implementing has been paralyzed, and there's all kinds of political pressures which are adding to that halt. But the Guarani are fighting back. They're calling for the government to map out their land urgently so that they can live on it and future generations can thrive. Some Guarani communities are getting so fed up with this wait for their land to be returned to them. So they decide to literally march back to their ancestral land, which is now occupied by a ranch, which could be planting sugarcane or soya, or there might be cattle on their land. And they decide literally to march back to their land and reoccupy it because it's so fundamental to them. And often their life greatly improves as a result of that. You see they become happier and more confident, and they build their prayer house, which is a sign of them feeling like they can be Guarani once more. But on the other hand, these reoccupations do often lead to violence, and many, many Guarani leaders have been assassinated after leading their communities back to their ancestral land. Just as I was on my way to Vienna, actually, I received a call from some of the Guarani because one of the communities, Curusumba, had just reoccupied a part of their land, and the ranchers had sent their gunmen in to attack and to burn down all of the Guarani's houses. Some kids apparently are missing, so we're waiting for news on that to see. Hopefully they are alive and well. This isn't an isolated case. We received a video message last week from another community called PHYTO Aged, where gunmen there had also burned down some of the Guarani's houses, and we received this message from one of the leaders who said that he has lost absolutely everything, and all he has now are the clothes that are on his back. So this is something that's going on around the state, this violence, this intimidation by the ranchers and their gunmen, trying to put the Guarani off going back to their ancestral lands, which they need so much. As I said, though, the Guarani are really fighting back, not just for their lands to be mapped out, as I mentioned, but also for companies to stop buying produce from their land, for example, sugarcane. And this is particularly where the international public really comes into the story, because many times it's international, multinational companies in our globalized world, isn't it, that are buying produce that are being cultivated on indigenous land. So the Guarani, together with some of their allies in Brazil and also with Survival, campaigned very strongly against Shell, the Anglo-Dutch oil company Shell that we all know, which was engaged in another company in Brazil. They were buying sugarcane from Guarani land. After that international campaign, Shell was forced to stop and to back down. The same thing happened with a big American food company called Bunge, which was buying sugarcane from Guarani land, and actually which was selling some sugar on to Coca-Cola. So who knows, if any of that sugar ended up in some of the Coca-Cola that we drink here in Europe. So again, the Guarani and their allies, we fought against that, and they have also cancelled their contracts. So, of course, that's one drop in the ocean. There's much more work to be done. But my point is that pressure can work. If it comes from the Guarani and if it's supported by people in Brazil and around the world, it can work and it can make a difference. And they're also uniting a lot with tribes across the country, because I think many indigenous peoples have realized that there's now no time to lose with this strongly anti-indigenous movement in the Brazilian Congress. Currently, over 50% of seats in Congress are occupied by people of the Bancada Ruralista, the rural lobby group, which is very anti-indigenous, very pro-agribusiness. And Guarani and Indians across the country are really fighting hard against their attempts to change the constitution to weaken indigenous land rights. So it's incredible, really. In Brasilia at the moment, I think it's still going on, a kind of constant protest, of a kind of relay protest, where different people from different indigenous groups across the country are camping near the government offices in Brasilia to say no to these attempts to weaken their rights. And so now I'd like to kind of move on to quite a different situation, which is that of uncontacted peoples in the Amazon. And uncontacted peoples are those who have no regular or peaceful contact with non-indigenous society. Probably most of you have seen some of the news about uncontacted peoples in Brazil and around the world, and seen possibly the photos and the video that were taken from a plane, a government plane that was flying overhead a few years ago. So uncontacted peoples, as we can imagine, rely completely on their forest for their survival. And where their forests are protected, they can survive and they can thrive. And those photos and that video show that the uncontacted indigenous peoples in Acre state, for example, where the Huni Kuin live, have gardens full of manioc, full of papaya, full of bananas, and their bodies are painted with the red urucum paint and the black genipapo, like the black paint that you can see on Daniela today. And you can see that these peoples are healthy when their lands are protected. There are more than 100, there are estimated to be more than 100 uncontacted tribes in Brazil, and another few dozen in other countries around the world, although the vast majority of uncontacted tribes are in the Amazon, particularly in the western Brazilian Amazon, in the Huni Kuin region, where there is the highest concentration of uncontacted tribes anywhere in the world. And these peoples are the most vulnerable societies on the planet because they can be killed by violence at the hands of outsiders who are trying to steal their lands and their resources in the name of progress and development and industrialization. And also diseases brought in by outsiders can be fatal for them because they don't have resistance to these outside diseases. And a couple of months ago, I spent some time with some Awaguajá indigenous people in the northeastern Brazilian Amazon in Maranhão state. And there are 3 Awaguajá there who had just made contact with surrounding society. They were uncontacted before, and they made contact in December with the already contacted group of Awaguajá. So these 3 people are the most recently contacted people in the world that we know of. And it was shocking to see, really sad to see, that one of the women was extremely ill with tuberculosis, too weak to move or talk or eat. And this is just one small illustration of the devastating impacts forced contact can have on indigenous peoples. In the case of the Awa, this contact happened as a result of the illegal logging, which is going on in the Awa's land, which, if we go back a few decades, we realize that, in turn, is a result of the Great Carajás project, which was the construction of the largest open-cast iron ore mine in the world and a transport network to transport the iron ore from the mine to the coast. And that project was funded by the World Bank and the then European Commission. So again, we see the impacts of our globalized world and monies being used from one country to another and abusing indigenous people's rights and putting their very lives at risk. And actually at the moment, we've just heard the news, maybe some of you have seen, that some Chinese politicians recently visited Peru and Brazil and signed an agreement with the Peruvian and Brazilian presidents to construct a railway line linking the Atlantic and Pacific coasts. And this is potentially catastrophic because this railway line, if built, will cut through hundreds of indigenous areas and protected lands and areas of very high biodiversity. The money will come from China. There's been no indication of consultation with indigenous peoples who have shown great opposition to the project. So that's something to watch out for, and that's something that we are very concerned about and want to fight more against. Because uncontacted peoples, including those in Acre, through which the railways plan to pass, show that they don't really want to be contacted. The images that we've seen show them pointing their bows and arrows up to the sky, to the helicopters or the planes that fly overhead. And if you walk in the forest of people in the Brazilian government have said that they walk in the forest near uncontacted tribes and they see cross spears showing that these uncontacted peoples just want to be left alone. And that's their right, really, to be left alone if that's what they want. If they want to make contact with the outside world, then I believe that's their right as well. But it shouldn't be forced upon them. And there are actually a couple of American anthropologists who are proposing now that the existence of uncontacted tribes is not viable and that therefore they should be contacted for their own good. This is an extremely worrying argument, really, and the Brazilian government policy at the moment is a very good one. The policy is protect uncontacted tribes' land and let them live on it and without invasions. Don't make forced contact. And that was a policy that emerged after many disastrous contact missions in the 1960s and then in the 1970s, where whole tribes were wiped out by violence and disease as a result. The Brazilian policy is often looked at by other countries' governments as a kind of milestone in uncontacted policy. So to change that or to even consider changing that kind of policy to a policy where you say that uncontacted tribes are unviable and must be contacted is an extremely dangerous mentality which really plays into the hands of the people, the very people who want to open up Amazonia for industrial development. And I think it's also just quite an arrogant idea to assume that you can force contact on these peoples. I say let them decide. And actually it's really interesting to speak with indigenous peoples who live close by to uncontacted tribes. And often they are the strongest people who voice the uncontacted tribes' right to be left alone if that's what they want. So in Acre, I've met quite a few Huni Kuin people who say that there are uncontacted Indians living really close by to their communities, and that the Huni Kuin have set up a system of patrols where they go into the forest and they try to make sure there are no invaders in the areas where the uncontacted are. And the same goes for the northeastern Brazilian Amazon. There's a tribe called the Guajajara, which lives right next to the Awa that I mentioned earlier. And they have set up a new system called the Guajajara Guardians, which involves teams, squads of Guajajara people going into the forest, setting illegal loggers' trucks on fire and, doing all kinds of things to put the loggers off and to try to help protect the land for their uncontacted relatives. The Awa have been fighting for a long time. The contacted Awa have been fighting for a long time for their land to be protected. And together with Brazilian NGOs and Survival, we launched a big campaign a couple of years ago, a 2-year successful campaign, which resulted in the expulsion, the eviction of all the illegal loggers from the Awa's central territory. So we see that when pushed, governments do take action to remove illegal invaders from indigenous lands. And it's all a matter of public opinion, really. Public opinion all around the world can make such a difference. And indigenous peoples always ask for that. They ask for as many allies as they can get to support them in their fight for their land. So the fight does continue. The Awa and Indians across the country are demanding that their lands be protected. And in the end, it really does all boil down to land rights. Because without land, indigenous people face catastrophe. But with their land, they can survive and they can thrive. And I think that we all have a responsibility to push governments, to push companies, to take notice in our daily lives as well of anything which might be linked to indigenous peoples, to make sure that indigenous peoples' lives and lands can be protected for future generations of indigenous peoples around the world, but also for all humanity. Thank you very much.
Sarah, thank you very much. I'm looking forward to the discussion that will happen later. Many questions, of course. Marcelo Piedrafita, on my left, has lived in the, or lives currently and has lived in the state of Acre for 25 years, about. He's an anthropologist. He's extremely knowledgeable of the Huni Kuin people. And we're very, very happy to be here today. He hosted us on our trip to the forest. And so reciprocity and symmetry comes from the heart. Thank you for being here.
First of all, I hope that my English doesn't fail me in my speech and that I can get to the end with a coherent content and message. I'd like, first of all, to thank a lot the museum and Danielle and Francisca, and especially the Huni Kuin and Neto, Ana, and their entourage for bringing us here to this very important moment. I remember a whole bunch of times when we had to take the Huni Kuin to political forums, to meetings, to things that they thought were important, that their participation was important. And nowadays I see that they're bringing us so far to places, important places, again, contemporary discussions and their future projects and their collective projects, and also individual trajectories of important leaders and new leaders that are searching ways of communication, of contacts, to put forward the possibility of having a different and a prosperous future for themselves and for their people. And so this is, for me, it's a big learning, seeing the Huni Kuin today, and how far some of these people are going, and the different places where they are traveling and putting forward their culture, their message. It's a big, for me, I'm still wondering what these new moments of communication, of travel, of contents really do. What do they search for? What do they really get forward in these places? Because, for example, last week we had Huni Kuin that were coming back from China. There were Huni Kuin that were coming back from India. There were Huni Kuin coming back from Norway. In a few days will be Huni Queens coming back from Vienna. And I think this is a very, very fruitful moment of dialogue, of construction in reality. And I think this is, we speak a lot of tradition, of safeguarding traditions, of bringing ancestral traditions to the present and reinforcing them and making them useful in the present. And I've been in Acre for 25 years, and I've been working with the Huni Kuin, and specifically with the Jordão Huni Kuin for this time. And I see a very long-term process of construction, not only tradition of making the same thing over and over and taking this to the future, but a process of creation that is very little predictable when things start, where things are going to go and what these processes are going to bring. I thought it'd be useful in terms of this process of creation and ancestral futures and all these type of identity building and political organization of these people in Brazil, but specifically for the Huni Kuin that are our guests here in in this incredible place that Neto has constructed for conversation, for the interchanging of knowledge. I thought it'd be useful to bring a little bit of this Huni Kuin creation in the last 2 decades in a really, of course, fast way. But for you, that today most of you are seeing the Huni Kuin for the first time, they have a very specific, a very modern, contemporary discourse that they're bringing to you about the cure, about traditional knowledge, about the need for contact, of new alliances, and that's. But I think that it's very important that we know a bit who these people are and what they lived. Why are they here? What took a little bit of their strong force to obtain rights, to today being possible of being in a place like this with a common project and a political project that can link and be accessible to so many different audiences, so many people from all over the planet. And so thinking about the trajectories of these people along the last years, I think is very important when we think what people are telling you today. They're getting here with a certain type of speech and a certain type of invitation to dialogue that is very important in contemporary days. But that makes me think of what I lived with them in the past decades, and I think it's very important that we maybe know some of the things, and especially as an anthropologist, I think that the times when anthropologists came to these places to say what the people are really saying, what the people are really thinking, I think this is, for my personal type of anthropology I like to do, I think these times are gone, because people are here to speak to you. The Huni Kuin are here to speak to you, to say what they want to say, to tell their own story. I'm not going to tell you the true story of the Huni Kuin in the last 20 years, but I think it'd be important for you to know some of the processes of what they passed in the last years, in order to understand better the impressive proposal that the Huni Kuin are bringing to you in these moments of dialogue. The speeching dialogues and their ritual dialogue also, which is a very important part of this contact, which not only brings you information of what they say, but brings you the possibility of living a bit of what they have to bring and what they have to share. So context of the Huni Kuin, where the Huni Kuin came from, and what I hear them saying, we're an indigenous people from Acre, we're an indigenous people from the forest, we're an indigenous people from the Amazon. And these people have a very interesting story that could be recounted in very different ways. And I could be recounting this as like a more general story of the people of Acre, of the indigenous people of Acre. I could be recounting you of a general story of the indigenous people in Brazil. And I think that some of these trajectories, these pathways of the Huni Kuin in the last year, of course, dialogue a lot with general process, political process in Brazil, legal frameworks of indigenous rights in Brazil. And of course, in discussion, I think we could bring this to a more contemporary discussion of threats, of opportunities for indigenous people. But I'd like to give you something of what I can really give you, something that I lived close to the Huni Kuin, and that I recognized parts of this way in the ways that Huni Kuin are here today. So when we speak now, we have this general idea of Brazil as a 500-year country, but the Huni Kuin, we live in a state that is 110 years old. Brazilians and Peruvians reached that part of the country, of Amazon, of a forest territory. 110 years ago, where there were a huge bunch of close to 50 different people, speaking of 3 different linguistic families, the Pan, which is the family of the languages that the Huni Kuin speak, the Arawak and the Arawa, and a whole bunch of. And the reason that took them there were the rubber, caoutchouc, which is a different species of rubber, and that took those people there. Now the Huni Kuin were living there in that forest. That's forest areas, other 50 communities, and they suffered at the moment. Of course, this is not the beginning of their life. There used to be a whole bunch of communication between these people, interchanges of knowledge, of people, of wars and rituals, parties, and between these people that lived around that place before the Peruvians and the Brazilians arrived. And these are very special also, Brazilians and Peruvians, because they're people that, in case of Brazil, came from the Northeast. In case of Peru, came from a very different. And this was a very tough time for the indigenous people in Acre, in what we call today Acre, because a very violent process of incorporation of these populations, violent raids, where obviously the objective of this was to take the people off the places where they have richness in rubber, and this was very hard moment for the people, because the population, of course, fell a lot of armed raids and assassinations and what we call correrias there in Acre, diseases. Of course, the spreads of the people had to redistribute along that huge territory there. And that started a moment that lasted for like 70 years. That was the work in the rubber states of Acre. The rubber states of Acre, which was at a certain time, very short time, for like 20 years, but was the most productive area of rubber in the world. Before the plantations started in the southeast of Asia. So this was a very specialized enterprise where indigenous people at first didn't have a place, and at the second time for like 70 years were a very important source of labor for these rubber states, a very important source of knowledge about the forest, about the plantings, about hunting, that used to be very important for the rubber states to function. Of course, this was very harsh for these people, because they didn't have territories, they didn't have land, they weren't recognized as indigenous people, they were recognized as caboclos, which there in Acre means like a person of a different quality, of an inferior quality of people. They were prohibited to speak their lands, to do the rituals, to migrate, and visit the different communities. And the Huni Kuin of the Jordão had a very special form of insertion in that society. They were, in a certain way, lucky people, but of course they were luckier people, and of course they were something that is very fond and is very essential of the Huni Kuin, which is the ability and always the will to be relationed with the outside, the curiosity and the receiving of. But the Huni Kuin of Jordão, which are originally from the Envira River, another river, were in a certain way contacted by a very different man at the time, which was called Felizardo Cerqueira, which was an important man for the initial contact. And it was, of course, when we see today, we think, oh, these men, they were conquistadores, violators of rights. But at the time, when the only destiny thought for Indians was death, annihilation, hard work. Now, this was one of the persons that thought that it'd be better to incorporate these Indians into work than to exterminate those Indians. And that was a very important, respectful man of many of the traditions of the Huni Kuin. The Huni Kuin, after Felizardo left from the Jordão, he took like 300 Huni Kuin in 1915 to the Jordão River. And after Felizardo left the Huni Kuin, the Huni Kuin managed, and these are the great-grandfathers of, for example, Fabiano, Chico Curumim. He managed to make alliance with an old widow, Velha Marculina, which lived in one of the rubber states of the Jordão, and she was a widow. She didn't have any big family at the place, and the Huni Kuin turned their family, and that guaranteed a small, little territory in the middle of the huge white territory of rubber states. And that was an important place of maintenance of language, of culture, of certain traditions, specifically for the Huni Kuin. But the Huni Kuin, as a part of a bigger number of populations, I don't know if I'm making lots of sense for you, I hope I am. Were in the beginning of the end of the 1970s, when we had the FUNAI was coming to Acre for the first time, and there were campaigns in Brazil of FUNAI is the federal foundation for the indigenous issues in Brazil. It's like the Bureau of Indigenous Issues of Brazil. And so the Huni Kuin started for the first time with the help of anthropologists that went there for the first time to prove that the indigenous people existed in Acre, because official stories said that there were no more indigenous people in Acre. An important person of this unpredictable things of life, as Felizardo was an important person at a certain time, as Marculina was an important person at a certain time, Terry Vale de Aquino was, I think, another very important person, opportunity that the Huni Kuin really grasped as an opportunity to break a big scenario. But the fight for the land rights that was at a certain time, people didn't even believe they had rights to land. They didn't even believe they have rights to live in a place without a boss, without living in that. Started in the end of the 1970s. And of course, the rubber state had functioned with a very particular mode of domination of the rubber bosses, with the patrons, and with production, merchandise, and a way of captivity that was associated with debts. And the first important thing that the Huni Kuin, with the help of Terry, realized was that they had to control that mode of the organization of their collective production and appropriation of lands. Land rights, the guarantee of a demarcated land, of a recognized land by the government, wasn't enough to. And so the first big challenge of the Huni Kuin was, and the first act that they took was to make this big collection of traditional art and to search alternatives for the commercialization of that art collection in order to get the first resources, financial resources, in order to start their cooperative, a collective way of organizing production and the commercialization of rubber, which was their main product at the time. The organization of the cooperative brought a challenge of how to manage that. Now, the commercialization, the organization, accountability. And they thought that they needed to start their own education, their own teachers, their own education with their own contexts. That started, of course, backed up by NGOs in Brazil and in Acre especially. The Pro-Indian Commission of Acre, that started in 1979, was a very important backup for the Huni Kuin, still are to these days, and gave, of course, legal and technical advisory for the land right fight that started in 1977, and for the start of the formation of indigenous teachers in Acre, of which the Huni Kuin of Jordan were part in 1983. In 1983, 16 indigenous teachers started. Many of them never saw a pencil, never write it. And they started a process that nowadays, of course, I'm going to be very short in some of the process, but they started a process in the state of Acre that, of course, now is a public policy also with all the conquests and threats, that today we have in Acre 430 indigenous people, teachers that teach in their own schools. Now we have 180 university teachers that passed through intercultural courses, courses in universities, and that was mainly at the time to learn to write and in Portuguese and to learn math, to have the control of the organization of their production at the first moment. Of course, that brought the content, that content and the appropriation of methodologies, of the material, of the didactic material that they have to use to their own schools. That brought also the threat of having better health systems adapted to their own traditions, but also to having control over medicines that they had been using for almost 100 years, that were also a source of domination, that were also a source of illness more than cure, antibiotics and things like that. And so also they with the help of NGOs, of universities, they started forming their first health agents, of which Savio, that is here, is a representative. Now we have a representative of the first health agents. One of the Huni Queens that are here is one of those persons. Now those are the third generation of people after contact. So we have leaders that were starting at that moment, mobilizing and fighting for rights. That started in 1977. In 86, they guaranteed this land, now of 86,000 hectares. Now their schools, their health specialists that mixed the traditional with some of that Occidental knowledge also. And the Huni Kuin, in 1986, the women started to thinking about how handcrafts, and that was also an important production of knowledge and a new agents, because you had very little masters, old masters, that still knew how to weave and how to paint and how to fabric ceramics, how to fabric cloths. And that was a very important also with the help of people outside, but mainly giving them conditions of reuniting young women to learn how all these practices, but also all the rituals and all the knowledge that was associated with this important part of the culture, that also has to do with food, that also has to do with seeds, that also has to do with a whole bunch of important things that women are the guardians of that. Also, the Huni Kuin in 1975 in the Jordan River were 370 people. Nowadays, in 2015, there are 3,100 Huni Kuin living in that land that was demarcated in 1986, and 2 other lands that were furtherly afterwards conquered by the Huni Kuin. They occupied lands in the beginning of the 90s, and with projects and with their alliances, with Outer, we managed to buy 15,000 hectares of land for $7,000 at the end, and that it was an important moment of also creativity and expansion of their territories. But that's we speak of the challenge that we have as a human planet, and overpopulation and the scarcity of resources, and the way we manage to and the wisdom that is going to be necessary to survive in a. The Huni Kuin face the same challenges in a certain way, because they live in a limited amount of their own land. Of course, they have, and today in Acre, we have 46% of the state is recognized as indigenous territories, as conservational units, and that's a very important 2 million hectares. We have a border with Peru that also has 6 million hectares of protected, at least legally protected lands. And so we have a very important portion of the Amazon, but the people that live in demarcated lands have important threats with population, with concentration, with urban settlements that are getting close to their land. And the Huni Kuin are facing these threats in a very creative also. And if speaking about the agents of change, of creativity. In 1996, the Huni Kuin started also as a part of a program of agroforestry agents, the people that are responsible nowadays in Acre, the young generation of people that, of course, in dialogue with leaders, in dialogue with old people, in dialogue with the women in certain ways, but are the coordinators of activities that have to do with the management of territories, of limited territories, in order to map those territories, know the potentiality, the things that exist in that territory, and how we organize these territories in certain common rules and ways of thinking, the future, the way of appropriation of these lands, how to think the surroundings of this territory, how to manage our internal issues, and how to manage our dialogues with our neighbors, with institutions, with allies. And that's a very important process of collective thinking, the present and the past, and the future, how we're going to be surviving, adapting to situations. And I think this is a very important moment also, because the crisis in the rubber economy in which the Huni Kuin lived, and in which they depended to be inside a regional economy, was at the time was a moment of where are these people gonna, how these people are gonna. Because I think the conquer, from Caboclos, the conquering of the name of Kaxinawa at the time, we're Kaxinawa Indian. That was a very important conquest of identity. We're Kaxinawa of the Jordan River, we're Kaxinawa of the Acre River, of the Acre territory. That was a very important conquest. But what was going to be the content and the discourse in this moment? Now we are rubber tapper Indians, to prove themselves as productive beings, cultural beings, that were respected in that regional society. So we're rubber tapper Indians. And when the rubber tap, now we're rubber finished. Many of us thought, now where are these people gonna, how are they gonna travel? What is gonna be their way, their identitary construction and the way of presenting themselves to this outside world. And fortunately, and culture, and in this sense, that culture has been nowadays not only a discourse of anthropological discourse, we're going to study culture. No, the indigenous have appropriated of culture as a way of organization, as a way of presenting opportunities of presenting themselves to others and presenting themselves to dialogue with a wider world. And of course, meetings that were promoted by state government in the beginning of the 2000s were an important moment of a mirror for the indigenous people. Acre, we have 15 different indigenous people in Acre, not only the Huni Kuin, and the Huni Kuin from Jordan are one of the 12 indigenous Huni Kuin lands, and each land is a different Huni Kuin. Of course, they have common language, but in some places they don't speak their language anymore. They're close or far from cities. Where's the ways of organization? There are associations, there are projects. And these meetings with these indigenous people in Acre were a very important moment of a mirror, of seeing each other, indigenous people seeing each other. The Huni Kuin were very important, and the Huni Kuin of Jordão were very important as a mark of strong culture, of strong language, of strong chanting, of strong rituals, of ayahuasca, and they were a very important example for others. But that was a moment of strengthening of a common path in a certain way for these people of Acre, and for a common path of affirmation of the importance of the indigenous identity and the possibility of relating with Acre society, but with other scales of societies and alliance, not only in terms of political rights. We're looking for rights, we're looking for projects, we're looking for certain opportunities of the still very important threat and that the Huni Kuin face of importance, part of their collective existence, their collective fight for right obtainance and for right guarantees. But a discourse that I think is very political. I think this moment is very political. I think the opportunity of opening a museum like this for the Huni Kuin, being here and speaking to you and opening moments of interaction with you is a very political moment. I think what Neto is doing with his art is very political. And I think that what the Huni Kuin are doing in this moment with a new production of identity, and this that you see nowadays of the Huni Kuin painted with all these, is a recent production also. Of course, this drinks from tradition, this drinks from a mythology, this drinks from a whole historical background and historical legacy that they carry as a group, and they carry as individuals, and as individuals of trajectory, as generation. But of course, this is also a very important contemporary production of an aesthetics, of a way of presenting themselves and presenting a possibility of dialogue with a whole bunch of different things. I think travels were always an important part of Huni Kuin existence. In traditional settings, when they used to visit communities, in their travels to Rio Branco, to Brasília, to reinforce their rights, in their travels to other communities in order to help them to organize, to conquer their rights, in their travels to for their formation as teachers, as health agents, as agroforestry agents, the women also in their travelings, less, but nowadays in their travels to try to conquer and to adapt to capturing mechanisms of the regional, the national society also, in local ambience like social benefits, which are things we have to think a lot. But traveling was also is always an important way of the Huni Kuin, of dialogue and presentation. And I think this is a very important moment. What I'd like to bring to you is, of course, we could be speaking of very different things, but and we that come from Brazil, and I think we have an obligation to inform you of things that are happening in Brazil and things that you could be helping the indigenous people in Brazil in their fight for rights and for the violations of their rights. But I thought it was very important to bring you a little bit of this history and then a little bit of this active production of sociality, of humanity that the Huni Kuin have been doing in this adaptation, in this reaffirmation of tradition, but at the same time constructing tradition. And I think we have to be very calm to see tradition as a construction. We don't have to be afraid of how legitimate this is, or this is not, this is new, this is not culture, this is... No, I think we have to be very alert to this, the importance of these opportunities, of connections, of so many different scales of knowledges, of so many different generations of knowledge that are being brought and that are being arising in this moment of big questions for humanity. I imagine for European society, for your societies. I was very impressed for the first, Neto was in Rio Branco with us at the time, and I saw the first papers of the symposium, and very big questions are being asked here, and I think they respond to big questions of humanity, big questions of European society, of our societies. I think Neto is thinking so many important things also for the importance of indigenous knowledge and tradition for Brazilian society also, for our patterns of development, of civilization, and I thought, I was thinking, wow, the Huni Kuin, because I always look what I'm speaking of you, where they came from, and what is their message, what are they bringing, and what is their contribution for these moments of deep thoughts and deep important decisions that we're taking about our future, our future as humanity, as societies, as people also. And so I think this is a very important moment of creation, and an important, and we have to be very responsible, and we have to be very thoughtful of the contribution that each of us brings to these moments. And I think the Huni Kuin, they have a very important message at this moment, but I don't think they have the solution for the cure. So of something that they're speaking a lot of, curing, of healing, of. I think they're doing their part. They're doing their part in their territories. They're important people for now important global discussions of environmental services, of protection, conservation of forests, and they're doing their part, and they need help in doing their part. But I think we have to, as individuals, as collectivities, know how to drink on this diversity of messages in order to construct possibility of connections that help both ways. And I think the Huni Kuin are giving a very important contribution in this way, bringing their own best wishes and their best practices of healing, of relations, of adaptation, of respect to your culture, to your way of being or receiving people that are going to their lands. And that's a very important teaching, receiving, knowing how to travel, knowing how to observe in order to rethink contemporaneidade. And this is our big challenge, to think today, to bring from yesterday, to think our today, and to bring better ways of living for everyone, in different scales, our families, our communities, our societies, the world as a community, as Gaia, as we. And so I'm very, very happy to be here. I'm very, very happy to be here in this house, in this important museum. But inside this museum, this house that Neto has built for this, I think his art is incredible as art. But when I saw the first projects, I saw, but you're doing a cupichá where people are going to be sitting and conversating and interchanging. So this is an opportunity, a very important opportunity. I think that the Huni Kuin are here, and they're going to be here for a long time. They're not passengers of Europe. They're starting a big travel, and they're starting a big travel that has things to tell you. I think that prepare yourselves to be receiving these type of people. Not only the Huni Kuin, lots of people are coming from the forest, are coming from very different experiences, and I hope that as they receive you well in their homes, that you can receive them well as you are receiving them well here, and that we can have very fruitful fruits from this interaction and from this creative and this unpredictable process of connection and dialogue that will help them in continuous production of tradition, of identity, of worldview, and I hope that they can be also helpful in your production of humanity, identity, sociality, future products, and I hope that we have good time these next days still, and that this has a very long-lasting healing effects, as the Huni Kuin always say, on all of us in our personal, affective, professional, and our future plans. Thank you very much, and I hope this was useful for you.
Thank you, Marcelo. As I said earlier, I will faithfully stick to the plan of our schedule, which means we have half an hour for discussions and Q&As. Any urgent questions from the audience, just to make sure that there is nothing we forget? No urgent questions. So maybe we should start with a round of discussion, and maybe more questions will come in. Bia, do you want to join us? Maybe if you have. So Bia Labat is going to speak this afternoon, but I ask her to join us as well. My first question, Fabio, to you is, obviously we all agree and we all know how important the habitat for indigenous communities is, and in this specific case, for the Huni Kuin, the rainforest around Acre, but also the Amazonian rainforest in general. And I don't want you to paint an entire picture, but what are the most immediate threats in terms of environmental changes? What are the phenomena that in the next future we see, or we already see happening, will be happening? What do they need to prepare for, other than the government and and the Chinese-funded trains, which is the next question to you, but on an ecological level?
Well, I think there are two. I think you pointed out very well. There are two types of problems there. There's the human action, and I think that in addition to everything that Sarah mentioned, in my view, the problem in Brazil is still there, but as compared to the neighboring countries, Brazil has a lot more protected areas, has strong legislation, has some level of enforcement, and what begins to be a problem now is what we call leakage. Is the problem as Brazil becomes more under control for protection in the Amazonian area, the problem migrates across the border. So if you go, I spent many years working across the border of Brazil with the other countries, and when you see at the border at Guyana, at the border with Peru, Bolivia, Suriname even, it's quite shocking. And a lot of the problem is caused by Brazilians that migrate, and they buy cheap land, they reach a country where there's no environmental legislation like ours. So the part of Amazonia that's inside Brazil is 60% only. 40% of Amazonia is in other 7 countries. So it's not enough to keep Brazil functioning well. It has to be, Amazonia has to be treated as one, rather than a set of, you can't deal with it country by country. It has to be treated in an integrated fashion. So for me, this is the main political problem. There's still some type of agreement that has to be reached between the various countries there so that Brazilian economy doesn't cause too much trouble as we move across the border. But from an environmental perspective, and we discussed earlier a little bit about climate change is already happening. And to give you an idea, during the past 10 years, we have had more extreme climate events in the Amazonia than we have had in the previous 100 years. So lots of big flooding, lots of droughts, and you guys may have heard, even in Acre, we have had some serious issues there recently, and these are becoming more and more frequent. You know, extreme climate events, they are a result of climate variation. They do happen eventually, but they are beginning to be more frequent than they used to be, which is again a sign of climate change. Since the 90s, there's a very good model from the IPCC, the Panel of Climate Change of the UN, that shows that climatic conditions, even if we reduce carbon emission significantly, by 2100, parts of Amazonia may become savannized. As it rains less, the conditions get warmer. Parts of Amazonia may in time look more and more like Cerrado. Of course, this modeling is very much based on climatic factors only, and as I said earlier, we don't know enough about the biology of the species to know as to whether they're going to behave this way, if they're going to migrate or not. But the fact is that I hear from some of my colleagues in Brazil from an NGO called ISA, is an NGO, Instituto Socioambiental, is an NGO that works with indigenous people, mostly across Amazonia, and they've been telling me that they have data soon to be published about how indigenous reserves are becoming drier in parts of Amazonia. So I think climate change, it is a big issue. And it is synergistic, because if you cut down forests, the carbon emission of that is huge. Up to about 10 years ago, no, 5 years ago actually, carbon emission of Brazil, 60% was due to deforestation. Now it's a third of Brazil's emissions, a lot less, because deforestation has reduced in Brazil very much during the past few years, although not enough. But it's now a third of the emissions. So we cut down forests, we contribute to climate change, climate affects the forest, and it goes like that. So it affects the whole planet, actually, but the local effect, there's a lot of concern, and we're going to see the Climate Convention conference in Paris in December. There are hopes that there's going to be a global agreement. I'm not so sure if a global agreement is going to happen or not, but the fact is that oftentimes when we talk about climate change, people are concerned about the planet as a whole, which I think is precious. And deforestation in Amazonia affects the planet as a whole, but we haven't been paying enough attention on how deforestation in Amazonia affects local people. And I think the only possible development model for Amazonia is one where nature is conserved and poverty is reduced. 40% of people in Amazonia are poor.
Well, that leads me to my next question, maybe just a quick answer. Are there any plans, any ideas to make indigenous communities participate of the richness of the Amazonian forest, and for instance, all these carbon trades that are being made basically on Amazonian land and on their behalf? Is there any kind of thinking in place, or there's a reverberation, I think, between us, that this could happen in any near future?
Yeah, there's a number of systems in place. Most of them are small scale, good models that are happening in one village, in one little town. But there are a few, in at least 3 countries, I can give you 4 countries actually, I can give you examples of national level schemes that are taking place. Brazil has a scheme called Bolsa Verde, which is a system that pays for landowners, especially poor landowners in Amazonia, to maintain part of their forests intact in their own property. The similar system happens in Ecuador. It's called Sócio Bosque. In Bolivia, we have Conserbo. And to give you the example of Ecuador that comes to my mind now, Socioboski has been there for 5-6 years now, and they have already protected 1 million hectares, and 100,000 people are benefiting from that. So with the little money they get, they move away from poverty. But mostly, I think the examples, they still lack scale, and this scale has to be built up.
Thank you, Fabio. Sarah, recently when Aiton Krenak presented his new book and his book of interviews, I received a message basically from Ernesto saying, in one interview, I think you have to take it away, sorry. In this interview, he says, today is the worst time for indigenous people in Brazil. It's never been that critical and bad. Aiton Krenak is a political leader and a cultural leader of the Krenaki people from Mato Grosso. Do you agree with him?
Well, I think there have been tough times in history throughout Latin America, haven't there? And for example, in the decades where the national policy of Brazil and its neighboring countries was to integrate all indigenous peoples into national society, whether or not they liked it, I think that must have also been a very tricky time, especially when, as I touched on earlier, dozens of uncontacted tribes were contacted as a result, and many were wiped out. If they weren't wiped out, lots of their relatives died, massacres, violence, lots of attacks as a result, and some indigenous...
Is it so bad today?
Well, today it is very difficult given the political situation in Brazil, but also given all the pressures from outside and, for example, China wanting to fund this railway and claiming that it might help the local population, for example, but actually it's very, very unlikely to help the local population or to make any difference at all on poverty rates, for example, or on the quality of life for indigenous peoples. Actually, what it will do is destroy vast swathes of the forest. So these kinds of projects, which are happening more and more and are being allowed more and more at the moment by governments, pose such huge threats. We've seen what happened with the railway in the northeastern Amazon, and the same thing could happen again now in Acre. But at the same time, I think at the moment, and having spoken with lots of colleagues and experts in Brazil, lots of contacts, lots of indigenous leaders, it seems to me that at the moment there is a very strong sense of unity between indigenous peoples in Brazil, and more protest than there was 10 years ago or 20 years ago. Others can disagree with me if they like, but this is the impression that I get. And I think that's really important because we've seen that it can make a difference. The change to the constitution, for example, which would be disastrous for tribes because it would mean that their land would be much, much worse protected, has been suspended as a result of the coming together of all of these different peoples nationwide. And of course, technology helps that. Facebook is a incredible place where indigenous peoples are coming together, making their voices heard, speaking with people very far away, getting others on board in their struggles. We've actually got a new project as well called Tribal Voice, where indigenous peoples in remote areas can send very short video messages out to the world, which are transmitted almost live. So there's definitely more of this kind of feeling of unity and strength against the threats. And I'm hoping that that is what can lead to a better future for indigenous peoples in Brazil and elsewhere.
Maybe before I ask Bia to take over and join us with a few questions, maybe a comment, half a comment, half a question to Marcelo. I think when you spoke about indigenous people like the Huni Kuin traveling the world, I was thinking, that one of the main challenges today, obviously, for anyone, is to get heard and to get believed in what you say. And, I think we all believe it's hard to believe politicians, it's hard to believe, sort of state functionaries. So, who do you believe, right? And I think this question of belief and relating to is very important as a question of, almost a fundamental question of democracy in a certain sense. And in my own field, I'm too sort of stuck to this particular field. I see more and more that artists sometimes take that role. Yeah? That somehow the work of an artist, because he has a certain form of autonomy, he's not believed as being kind of entangled in a certain form of corruption, whatever. So in a way, these missionaries, these diplomats, yeah, these people who have the possibility, the ability to speak and to get heard in, let me say, authentic ways, in original ways, in personal ways, that is so important. And I think the fact that indigenous people speak for themselves and are not being spoken for by others, and are no longer just trying to find representation, or had possibly no other ways of speaking up than through forms of representation. I think that is an incredibly symbolic moment, and I think this is the change that I see. It's not that they will save the world or that they know the cure to the world, but they're messengers, and they're messengers from a deep past, and they're messengers with a great consciousness, and they're messengers who have, who have forgiven on their own histories, who have actually purified a lot of bad energies, if we want to use that sort of imagery, and to come here and sort of not just reinvent their past, but also help us to find ways into redefining these ancestral futures. So it wasn't really a question, but maybe you'd like to comment on that.
No, I think you've said it all, and I think I tried to say that at the end of the speech also. Yes, I think. And for me, it's a big wonder, because as I've told you before, traveling and representation and demanding and proposing other ways of organization, of respect, of relationship with governments, with white people, is also a constant of the Huni Kuin history in the last 30 years. And for me, it's a big wonder that the content of this present, traveling and dialoguing, and that they can be not always. I think they're so generous. At least these Huni Kuin that are here, because they speak. Very little of their needs and they speak of their processes, of their consciousness, of their tradition, of their knowledge, and this as a process also of construction. But they speak a lot of serving other people. So this is a very generous way, because before you had to go out to speak. And of course there are Huni Kuin who still do this. They're in need of this, of speaking politically, for rights, for fundamental land rights, fundamental health rights, education. They're still. But these people that are here today, they're very generous people in the way that, of course, they are in a very intricate way of constructing, of rebuilding, reinforcing that tradition and rethinking knowledge in terms of contemporaneity. And I think products, incredible products that we see here, artistic, not only like in dialogue with, for example, with Neto, but the Huni Kuin themselves, they were in exhibitions also, art exhibitions in Cartier Foundation in Paris, and big exhibitions there. The importance of so many products also, videos, CDs with music. The book, the Livro da Cura is an incredible, and I think that yesterday you heard Ana, you heard Alexandre of what the production of that book was, not only in terms of the book as a product, but the book as a process, as a seed, and as a reinforcement of new generations, of new works, of new conceptions of how to use tradition and to form new forms of sociality and of dialogue. So I think for me it's a big wonder also. I think as the same as for you Europeans to see the Huni Kuin arriving and to pay a lot of attention to what they're saying. The same thing, I'm living there. I've lived with them for, of course, worked with them for the past 25 years, and I think that I'm learning as much as you are learning, and I want, as I think as most of you want, to be close to that process, because I think we all have to, we all have also our contribution, and we learn from that, and we can re-alimentate, refeed that process. And I'm in that same process as you people are in a certain way, of following this new renewed way of Huni Kuin interaction with respectful people and respectful imbalances of dialogue and construction of future possibilities and construction of useful meanings for different types of people in that interaction. So I think this is a very important moment. I'm very happy to be here. Just one little word. I think I don't know if this is the worst moment of indigenous history in Brazil. I think it's the actual moment, and that is important conjunctions of things that need help and mobilization and union, and the people are, in fact, mobilizing in ways to confront threats that come from different order of things, and of course the demarcation of lands and the importance of land. Indigenous lands in Brazil are 20% of the country, and of course there's interest, agriculture, entrepreneur interests that go against that land, that they think that those lands are against progress. They're lands that they don't see the importance of those lands as, and so this has repercussions in congruence nowadays, and the will to change the administrative rituals of recognition of indigenous lands that has very important interests with ruralist and company interest there. But we have threats also in the judicial system of Brazil. Still, we have a very important legislation that finally ended tutorship, seeing indigenous people as incapable people of having relative rights. The Constitution offered the recognition of land rights, but of people to organize themselves, to speak for themselves, to go into judicial process if necessary. And those are things that are being still worked with a very slow and with a very reactive attitude in the judicial sector, which is an important place of fighting and of construction nowadays. And of course, threats that come from development process with these huge infrastructure projects, dams, roads, mining, petroleum. So this is a very fine connection of threats that put a very important moment of reflection for new, renewed strategies of articulation of indigenous people in their communities, in their organization, in their pan-organizations, with their alliance, and even with international allies. And so you also have an important part of paying attention to that and to seeing how you can contribute, not only as individuals, as community, but also in the pressure you can exert over your governments and over your companies in their participation in processes that have to do with not only the appropriation of forest environments, and by saying that also indigenous lands, but also in big negotiations that go nowadays in climate change discussions. And we have important participation, and we have an important contribution that we're giving to humanity in conserving those forests and providing environmental services, humidity, water, air that goes, that is being used by the whole planet. But of course, we need help in order to think models of interaction, of resource distribution, and in order to make that policies that even will influence the way that development, progress, well-being will be thought in the future.
Okay, so we are very much towards lunchtime. Just want to tell everybody to wake up because everybody looks like they're sleeping a little bit. Huh? Okay. It's just looking from here that is a little bit good. I was supposed to make some questions, but we are on the end. So I'll just make one comment to give my contribution. I just want to cherish the organizers for putting together this panel, which I think is one of the highlights so far for the symposium, because a lot of the international expansion on the interest in indigenous peoples has to do naturally with ayahuasca and the enchantment of ayahuasca and people drinking ayahuasca and feeling so blessed. This has been a big way that indigenous people have, traveled the world. And sometimes the discussion can get apolitical and even alienated. So I very much think that this panel puts back on track that this is part of a larger discussion. And I think that the flow that appears from this thread of discussions is that there is this, there is not a lot of point, as Pedro was saying in the breakfast, to talk about protecting their medicines if there is no forest. How are we going to protect medicines if there is, the forest is destructed? So I think this was a little bit a line that guided everybody's discourse. Fabio was saying, look, we have to stop thinking of only what can the plant do for us, but what can the plants do for the planet? And what can we do for the planet on a larger scale? And also Sarah was pointing to this direction that indigenous people are doing a great deed for humankind as a whole in times of deforestation as they have sustainable practices. So I think this panel puts the discussion into a larger set of ideas, which is the need of thinking about the planet and indigenous rights and human rights and the importance of the Amazon to bring the political back into scene. I think that this whole connection between art and the political dimension is also a nice aspect for us to be commenting on the symposium that goes together with the exhibition. And I just want to make one little particular comment to Marcelo as a fellow anthropologist. You said that the Huni Kuin were very generous to be here. And as an anthropologist who is also Brazilian, I want to say that I think that your interpretations about the whole process are very generous as well. And I cherish you for that because you balance a level of criticism and reflection with a level of awareness, but also with a level of tolerance, of getting out of the orthodoxy of academia or of purism and saying, Marcelo is showing us, I was a little bit anxious to see if everybody was understanding, because he was conveying some very dense anthropological ideas, and with his Brazilian accent, I was not sure if everybody could picture how important was what he was saying, so I'm just going to take the liberty to make this one comment. He's combining both saying that the indigenous people are constructing their tradition, they are constructing their past, they are in a way creating their identity, but we don't have to be afraid of that. We don't have to be critical and to look for this deeper authenticity, because history is dynamic and culture is constantly evolving. And he shows us these very concrete ways which the Huni Kuin became to be what they are here now. It's a process he witnessed in part, and he fought for it. Land recognition, creating bilingual education, creating all this support. And I just think it's fabulous on the way he follows the pattern of the Huni Kuin, and thanking to be here. And the Huni Kuin thanks the Vienna organizers to bring them here. Marcelo thanked the Huni Kuin to bring him to Vienna. So I think that's a good wrap-up of these processes of exchange and, you know, symmetry, global and north. And I think we have more very cool things in the afternoon. I look forward for that.
Thank you very much. So lunch break, we have 1 hour, a little bit less than 1 hour, well, 58 minutes. We reconvene at 3 o'clock for the next panels, which are going to concentrate on the legal frameworks surrounding teacher plans and specifically, as we heard, ayahuasca, but not only. Thank you so much for your patience.